Okay, here we go again. Welcome to the Otherppl Show, a weekly podcast featuring in-depth conversations with today's leading writers. It is a books and culture show. I'm Brad Listi. This is my podcast. Welcome. How are you? I hope you're okay wherever you happen to be, all things considered. I have a great episode for you today. I'm going to be speaking with Naeem Murr, author of a new novel called Every Exit Brings You Home. It is available now from W.W. Norton and Company. This is Naeem's first book in 2 decades, and it is a deft meditation on the conflicts, the griefs, and the hopes of an immigrant community in Chicago in a condominium building. And most centrally, this is a novel about a man named Jamal Shaban. He goes by Jack in the United States, and he's trying to save his neighbors from bankruptcy. Jack is a very compelling character, a man of slippery identity, a member of the Palestinian diaspora who lives a very compartmentalized life. As a devoted husband, a flight attendant, a fixer, a liar, an adulterer, he is a man of many sides, and he is also a survivor of the violence of 1980s Gaza, where a taboo affair nearly upended his life. Every Exit Brings You Home is a novel of gentle comedy and poignant tragedy, and I had a wonderful time meeting Naeem Murr and talking with him. You will hear that conversation in just a moment. Today's episode is brought to you by Zando, publisher of Black Bag, the latest novel from Luke Kennard, now an official selection of the Otherppl Book Club. Black Bag is about an out-of-work actor who lands the role of a lifetime, sitting quietly in a college classroom, zipped into a large leather bag as part of a psychology experiment. What could possibly go wrong? This is a warped campus novel. It is funny, it is bold, it is insightful, and it deals with themes of identity, love, and the modern age. Unzip your psyche with Black Bag and get 15% off of your copy at bookshop.org by using the offer code Love Booksellers, all one word. Again, the novel is called Black Bag by Luke Kennard, available from Zando. Today's episode is also brought to you by Deep Dive. Deep Dive is a new learning platform that creates in-depth audio courses for writers. The latest course from Deep Dive is called How to Write Literary Collage. It is taught by David Shields, a master of the form, author of Reality Hunger and many other books. It is available now at deepdive.audio. You can also get the flagship course, How to Write a Novel, which is more than 50 hours in length and features nearly 46 acclaimed contemporary writers as instructors, including Emily St. John Mandel, Melissa Broder, Steve Allman, Stephen Graham Jones, and many others. So check it out. You can stream these courses online or via the Deep Dive app. For more information, visit deepdive.audio. So before we get going, I just want to give a plug to the Otherppl Book Club. That is my book club. I curate this club and have done for many years. It's a great way to keep yourself reading. It's a great way to support this show. It's less than the cost of a book, and you get a new book delivered to your door every 30 days. I interview book club authors on this program, so it makes for an enriching and holistic literary experience. For more information and to sign up for the book club, just go to this program's official website, otherppl.com. So my guest, once again, is Naeem Murr, and his new novel is called Every Exit Brings You Home. It is available now from W.W. Norton and Company. Naeem Murr is the author of 3 novels, including The Boy, which was a New York Times notable book, and The Perfect Man, which was longlisted for the Man Booker Prize. Naeem is a former Stegner Fellow at Stanford University and is a past recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship. He lives in Chicago. I am very happy to welcome Naeem Murr onto this program for the first time and to talk with him about this new novel of his. Again, It is called Every Exit Brings You Home, and it is available from W.W. Norton and Company. Here I am with Naeem Murr.
I had been working on another novel, which was based upon the lives of my Palestinian family, two of my Palestinian uncles. It was a huge historical novel, starting in 1938 and ending in 2018. It required enormous amounts of research, and it was just exhausting. And so I decided I was going to take a break and write some short stories. And I thought I wanted to write some short stories around the concept of home, not just about Palestinians. It was going to, there was going to be stories about Palestinians, but also, other stories sort of focusing on home. And so I was walking in my neighborhood and I came across this couple, a middle-aged couple, sitting in an old Chevy Impala, and they were leaning against one another and they looked bereft. They seemed at the same time entirely connected and entirely disconnected. And there was a baby in the back seat. The old Impala was hooked to a U-Haul trailer. And I couldn't tell if they were about to leave or were just arriving. And I just found this moment, this image incredibly evocative. And I don't know if it was then or later that it struck me that this felt like the moment after the fall in some essential way. Here were Adam and Eve, out in the world, in all the trouble of the world. So at the same time, I had been thinking about Gaza because there had been a flare-up. This was about 5 years ago. There had been a big flare-up of conflict in East Jerusalem. And so I was thinking about that, and I was doing some research into Gaza and into some of the camps there. And the camps are fascinating places because they sort of reconstitute the world before 1948 and before 1967. People from the same, villages and towns and areas all clustered together in these refugee camps. And so they are home because these people have been there, sometimes for a generation, but they're also not home. Home exists, in the past, and home exists in the future. But home doesn't exist here in this present time and in this present place. So, I was thinking about that, and this idea came to me to write a story about a man from Gaza and what happened when a single parent moves into his condominium building. And I was thinking about condominium building because it's a place where people have to share the same space, I live in a condominium building, and I know there's sort of lots of conflicts that have to be negotiated. So that was all I knew. I just knew that it was a man from Gaza. This woman moved in. That would set the story off. And I also knew exactly what the final moment of the story would be, which would be this image of the two of them sitting in that Chevy Impala. So I knew where I was going, and I knew sort of what set off the story. So I started writing the story, and almost instantaneously it came to life, right? It felt as if it had been gestating in me for a long time, for as long as I had been writing and researching that other book. And it felt as if that image had allowed all of the things I had been feeling and thinking, all of the themes of my work to sort of find a coherent story in some sense. So I started writing, and Jamal Shaban, who's the main character, who everyone calls Jack, just sort of came to life, and was sort of staring at me across the page. And it felt as if I was really not so much creating him as collaborating with him. So, and that's really how the story came. When the story started, I had no idea I thought he was single. It turned out he was married, and I had no idea about his past in Gaza, what had happened to him, but that sort of just developed organically as the story about the conflicts in the condominium building generated by this rather troubled and aggressive single parent moving in took their form and continued. So that's really sort of how the story came about.
It makes me think about this couple in this Chevy Impala with the U-Haul. Like, if only they knew what they sparked just by sitting there.
Right. It's happened to me a few times. I think with almost all the books all but one of my books, I think, they've been set off by something in the world, whether it was a story that someone told me, which in my first book, The Boy, was set off by a story a social work friend told me, and it was the same circumstance. I had been working on another book for about 5 years. I was a young writer. It was a book that was far outside my scope in terms of my capacity with craft and just my emotional and psychological scope. And then I went to visit this friend who told me this story, and instantaneously, as I was returning to my home from hers on the train, the story of the main character in The Boy, this sort of foster child who destroys a family, just started coming to me. And with The Perfect Man, it was a setting. It was I was walking in the floodplains in Missouri, and I came across a kind of abandoned town. And it literally felt as if, there had been the rapture. There were still clothes in the closets, children's toys. And there was something, again, very evocative about that. And that story is set in Missouri during the 1950s and 60s. And that's sort of what set that story off. So, I think, I feel that novels kind of gestate in you, and they have to be ready. They have to, there is usually something that then brings them to a kind of crisis of birth. And, it's a mysterious process for me.
Well, I want to talk with you about the main character in your book, this guy, Jack, whose given name is Jamal Shaban. And he moves with his wife, Dimra, from Gaza to Chicago. And I want you to just talk a little bit about how he came to you.
Yeah, it's interesting for me. All fiction is deeply sort of character based, and he just seemed to emerge out of that moment, out of that car as a character, and I think he is somebody for me who can't quite cohere. He's somebody entirely out of place. So when he was in Gaza. His mother was Egyptian, and she was from an aristocratic Copt family. So even in Gaza, the two of them, his father was almost always in jail, and the two of them lived a kind of bell jar life in Gaza, where she had an extensive Western library, and he and she, they spoke their own kind of patois of Arabic, English, and French. And lived within that literature. So when he went out onto the streets of Gaza, he had to code switch, himself, even in that place. So he was always out of place, which really reflects my own life in many ways. When I was when I was a baby, my mother brought me to Lebanon with my brother. My father was away. He was in Libya as an engineer. And we were there for 4 years until my father died. And then I returned to London. As a 4-year-old speaking Arabic, and I lost that place. It was, the hills above Beirut. It was sunny. It was the smell of pine, and I was suddenly in London, in the sort of the stale breath of the tube and the diesel. And we were in Kilburn in my grandmother's council flat, so there were sort of drunks lying in the street, and I'd lost, even though I was just a child and I have very little memory of that. I think of it as that moment. The reversal of that moment of The Wizard of Oz, where where the black and white Kansas becomes Technicolor Oz, right? Suddenly, I was in these sepulchral winters, and I'd lost the language and I'd lost the world. So when I think of it deeply psychologically, I didn't think about this at the time, but when I grew up in London, I felt always entirely out of place. My mother gave us she was Irish, and she gave us a sort of fake upper middle class English accent. And we lived in a big block of very working class people. So our accent itself was entirely out of place. I didn't feel English. I didn't feel Palestinian. I didn't feel Irish. So that sense of entire displacement, I think, sort of feeds into most of my work, into this sense of a person who's really struggling to cohere in terms of his identity. So I think really that's sort of the root of him, and he and Dimra are sort of mirror opposites to one another. I mean, she would say, I am Palestinian to the bone, and he she is like, I am who I am, whereas he is, I am not who I am. right? Which is what Iago says, right? I am not who I am. And I am who I am is what God says at the burning bush, right? I am who I am. Those people who have this incredibly strong identity, who feel completely unified by their nation or their religion, whereas he is this man, as I say, who's struggling to cohere, who lives a completely compartmentalized life. He's he's an airline, he's an air steward, and everybody in different parts of his life knows a different Jack. So his colleagues, his flight assistant colleagues, don't even know he's married. And I think that's his struggle, this sort of struggle to cohere and to move forward.
Well, not only is he, I mean, I think flight attendant is an interesting occupation to give him, because for somebody who has this slippery kind of identity and self-concept, he's always in transit. That seems like a very interesting job in that way. You get on these planes, you land somewhere, you might spend the night, you're back on the plane, you're never anywhere for super long. You might not even feel like you were ever actually there because you're just living your life in transit. And then there's also the issue of his sexual orientation and the story that he tells about himself to his colleagues. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, they most of them think that he is gay. As he's a flight attendant, and he at one point he was in terrible grief over the death of his mother. I don't want to talk too much about the plot, but a lot of people around him, including some people who are very close to him, just assume he's gay, and he sort of lets them assume that. And I think his sexuality, like him, is very complicated. It's he's very compartmentalized in that way as well, perhaps. But I think he is someone who simply sort of loves who he loves, right? I mean, he just connects to people and sort of loves them, and seems to be sort of entirely unprejudiced about what it is that he finds attractive and what it is he finds compelling in other people. But so I think that there's not a lot of focus on that. There's something that takes place in Gaza, a sort of forbidden relationship there, that then haunts him through his life, and it's one of the reasons he has to leave Gaza. But it's funny, it's funny because you asked me that question. I never really think of his sexuality. I mean, this is something that happened with The Boy, which was my first book as well, which is that also has, in a more sort of adolescent way, because it's a story about young people, this kind of real fluidity of sexuality. And the same thing with Jack here. There is a sort of fluidity, even though I think most of his relationships in the present action are all heterosexual relationships. But there is this real fluidity of sexuality that I never think of. But when the book goes out there, like, for example, on Amazon, you'll see that it's categorized as LGBTQ+, right? There is a way in which the world, it wants to take a book and say, well, this book belongs to this group, or is a part of this particular identity. And for me, when I wrote Jack, I never thought about that. Everything that happened to him just happened to him. And of course, in Gaza, it's a much more complicated situation because of the society that grows up in, an extremely conservative society. So I guess that's always a hard question for me to answer, because I don't think of him in any specific way in terms of his sexuality. He is just who he is.
Well, I mean, Jack is a character who is many things to many people. He doesn't have a really fixed identity. And you mentioned this word compartmentalization. He's a very fascinating character to me because he's such a gentleman. He's got this elan. He's got he's got very good manners, and there's a gentleness and a compassion in him. And yet he's lying a lot in his life. He's not necessarily operating with total honesty and integrity in his relationship to Dimra and his representation of who he is to friends and colleagues and people that he's close to. And he's holding a lot inside and is managing his emotions with a lot of, I guess you would call it, repression and control. And that set of circumstances, as somebody who has no capacity to be compartmentalized, I mean, maybe the most rudimentary capacity to be compartmentalized. Like, I'm the kind of person who just tells you, I couldn't live the way that he lives, where he's in relationship to Dimra and sort of doing things and living in ways that she's not even aware of. That's interesting. And yet I get it, when you think of him in context, coming from where he comes from and the background that he has and the set of circumstances that he finds himself in Chicago, I can see why he would be that way. He makes an emotional sense as a character, which is to your credit.
Well, thank you. Thanks. I think there are a couple of things I say here. I mean, one of the things is that there is this big difference between an authentic life and an alternate life, right? I mean, all of us, when our lives are not going well, we imagine an alternate life, right? One with a different lover, maybe in a different career, in a different life, that those alternate lives exist like parasites upon our true life, like our authentic life. And, we're always trying to struggle toward whatever. I don't think everyone has only one authentic life. I think we can have a number of authentic lives, but to move toward coherence, toward being the kind of person we want to be, making the choices we want to make, real choices. And he, as I say, he lives these kind of alternate lives, these separated lives. And each of them is, I think, emotionally and psychologically understandable. So, for example, he has a very close friendship with this woman, Krista, who he calls Birdie. And she is this completely innocent. She works with him. She's a flight attendant. She's entirely innocent, right? She's this young girl when he meets her, years before the actual present action. And she doesn't even know what a Palestinian is, right? She has no idea what a Palestinian is. So for him, she is a self and a future that's completely free of all of the pain of his past. I mean, he has this pretty traumatic past in Gaza, so she's free of that, and so that's what she is to him. And then you have Marcia, who is this single parent who moves into his building, and she's sort of aggressive and sort of very attractive to him in a certain way, but she really draws him back to the taboo relationship he had in Gaza, right? That is what she is. She is the past. She is this relationship from the past, this intensity, this sort of sexual intensity, as they sit in their own sort of ruined house, just as in Gaza with this other lover, he was in this cracked, little Eden within all of the trouble of Gaza. And then you have his wife, who's the third there, who is constantly looking back, but is pregnant. And that child, for both of them, it provides this sense of future, right? Once the child comes, they can become American. They can become translated into this world. That is the future for them, even as she looks at the past. So she's looking at the past, but is the future. You have Birdie, who for him is this person free of the past. And then you have Marcia, who is drawing him back to this love, this passion that he had in Gaza. So all of those compartments, and this is after the fact. I didn't think about this when I was writing it at all, but when I look back at it, I can feel like this is why he is fragmented in this particular way.
Well, I think you mentioned this earlier, or I read it in prep, where you were talking about your paternal family who were Palestinian refugees in 1948, and I think their experiences in particular caused you to think about what the concept of home means for a person of Palestinian origin. And when I think about Jack, having this Egyptian background, the mother who's Egyptian, and then being Gazan, and then marrying this woman who thinks of herself as like you said, like a to the bone Palestinian, and yet they live in Chicago, where they haven't maybe fully assimilated and they don't feel necessarily like they're fully American. It makes a lot of sense that somebody with that kind of background, and a background that's not entirely dissimilar to your own, to be compartmentalized. You know what I'm saying? I think that sort of experience almost forces you to be compartmentalized on some level, right?
Yes, yeah. I think that it forces you to be compartmentalized. The other element in him is shame. Um, just a profound shame, which I think somebody reading the book said, the word that I noticed came up most in this book was the word shame. He feels a deep shame. And I think shame is if anything's going to sort of prevent you from truly cohering, from wanting to be yourself, from wanting to seek some kind of authentic self, because you don't want yourself, you don't like yourself, you don't like what you see in the mirror, you are ashamed. At one point, his father says to him, just as he leaves Gaza, he says, "You're not nobody, right? You are not nobody." And the problem with Jack is that he does feel he's nobody, and that his central energy, I think we all have different kinds of central energies. Like I have, with Marsha, she tries to have anger as her central energy as a way to protect herself. And it's in fact just a self-destructive energy, as anger often is. It could be a very good energy. I have friends for whom anger is a very good and cohering energy for them. For I think for Marsha, it's not really, and this takes a while for him to realize it's not really a good energy. But for him, shame is the central energy, and which really also stops him, prevents him from cohering. He can't stop being nobody, as you said. He's a flight attendant, and so he's always in a liminal space. He's always trying to run away from his life. He spends a lot of time in anonymous hotel rooms, but of course, every exit brings you home. So every time he leaves, he returns, and he returns to Dimra, who's in herself in a completely isolated sort of bell jar, hooked up to a television, watching all the horrors of the Middle East. And so he has to return to that every time, just returning to the past. And it is a sort of existential, he's trying to move forward, but the past is still there. And, one of the ways I talk about him is as someone for whom the past is too full of love to entirely cauterize, and too full of pain to entirely integrate. So again, that sort of incapacity to bring himself together.
Well, before we go any further, I want to make sure to place the narrative in time, because I think it matters, particularly since what has been happening in Gaza in recent times has brought it into global consciousness to a degree that I don't think it previously had been. Mm-hmm. But your novel is not set in the immediate recent past. It's set a little bit before, correct?
Correct, yeah. So the novel, this is, it's so strange to be, to be writing this novel about Gaza, to have written this novel about Gaza. I finished the novel about a month and a half before October 7th, before everything sort of exploded, before all of those horrors. And the strange thing about the novel is that it begins in 2007 during the housing crisis. And so that's in Chicago. There's this housing crisis. So everyone is terrified they're going to lose their homes. Which is, part of the drama in the condominium association. And of course, that's also a drama that reflects losing one's home. About 2 million people, I think, lost their homes during the housing crisis. So, and that reflects sort of the Palestinian situation as well, all these people sort of losing their homes. And then it ends in a really early 2009 during what was then called the Gaza War, because it was the worst conflagration in Gaza up to that point and up to October 7th. So, and in the Gazan situation in 2007, what was happening then in Gaza was that Hamas had been voted in 2006, and there had been a civil war, and they were just consolidating power in Gaza in 2007. That's when they really consolidated power after this civil war. They won the civil war. So it's this weird sort of backward echo of what's happening now. It begins with Hamas. It ends with this terrible conflagration, this war. And then, as I say, I finished it, and October 7th happened. So it was, it was terrible.
Well, but I feel like sometimes this is what happens with writers, is that whatever's going on in their subconscious. This is also just the circumstances of your life, but in your personal history. But I just feel like authors sometimes work in ways that are mysteriously predictive or have these kinds of resonances that you don't see at the outset, but that become maybe draw into focus as you move forward and the book is published and sort of starts telling you what you were up to.
Yeah.
And there's another aspect of your novel that I want to talk about, and it's related to what you were saying earlier about shame, because it made me think a lot about secrets and about the parts of human beings that don't get shared. Or if they do get shared, they only get shared with a very small number of people. There's so much that we don't know about the people in our lives, including the people with whom we're intimate. There's a lot of mysteries to human beings. And I think maybe this is part of like the universal impetus that drives people who write fiction, is this desire to access those mysteries and to sort of see the truth and to render the truth of people and all of their complexity. But in addition, it makes me think of the weight of secrets and what it costs people to move through their lives, repressing things, holding stuff inside, not communicating like vital parts of themselves and vital parts of their experience, and not having an outlet perhaps to express themselves fully. This had to have been on your mind as you were creating Jack and Dimra and really the entire cast of characters in this novel. Like everybody is carrying the weight of their past in ways that are expressed or not expressed to varying degrees.
Yeah, I think that is very much, part of who Jack is. And I think the thing about the past with him, when we were talking about shame also, is that, there is also ways in which, you carry this weight, but particularly if you have shame, I think there's something in Jack that, that there are moments in his life where we feel that it becomes very aware of the evil within him, the capacity for evil within him. There is an incident in Gaza with someone where he sort of feels that he dehumanizes that person. So that memory is tied up with so many other memories. So just this sense of not being able to release things because they are so connected and attached to things that are shameful. Dimra is the same. I mean, Dimra seems, to Jack at the beginning, to everyone, to be this completely innocent person, who's, that she's almost childlike in a way. And toward the end of the book, we discover all kinds of things about her own experiences in Gaza that she is carrying. And I think that when you're, as a fiction writer, I think your characters have to have mystery. What gives a character dimension is mystery for you as the writer, that you never want them to feel transparent to you, certainly not central characters. You don't want them to feel transparent, that's what gives a character a power and a dimension, an ability to have control over their own fates. As a writer, you don't want to be, you want, there's that sacred trinity: reader, writer, character, right? All of them have to have equal weight and an equal sort of investment in the story. And as I say, that for a character, mystery is the central thing for the author as well as for the readers, that keeps them three-dimensional and that keeps them surprising you. As I say, when I started this story, I knew nothing about the backgrounds of either character. Just as the story developed, and they sort of came to life on the page, did that the weight of the past sort of start to emerge. And I've grown up, for me, silence about terrible things in the past is something that that is really in the crucible of my childhood. My mother was a single parent bringing my brother and me up in London. She had been deaf, so she dropped out of school at 14. She had to educate herself. She did 3 jobs. And she told us nothing. She had this accent, which was this, as I say, this upper middle class accent, because her Irish brogue had been sort of knocked out of her in her convent school in Dublin. And she never told us, we never had any contact with her Irish family. I didn't realize that she had a sister and two brothers. But she had this terrible Angela's Ashes kind of past in Ireland, all of the worst things you could possibly imagine, sort of abuse and, terrible family situation, all the worst things you could imagine that she had been through, which you would never know when you encounter her. She's this sort of delightful storytelling person. But as a child, you absorb, there is a way in which you're talking about the subconscious. You're with this person who is everything to you. My mother was everything to me, me and my brother. She was all we had. And out of her silence, when I think of that silence, it feels to me that that's an enormously generative silence, right? Or some terrible burden was there that kind of got into me, and that silence became the stories that I needed to tell, right? So out of that silence, when I think of why I'm a writer, what creates these stories is that it comes out of that silence, out of my mother's silence. And, my father was a little black and white photograph on my bedroom mantelpiece. And that's this even huger silence, right? That's the sort of the silence of death. There's this little aperture into this man who is my father, and it's absolutely silent. So there are different kinds of silences sort of vying, right? This sort of, profound silence of death, and then the silence of human suffering that sort of was, my mother was the aperture to that. My father was the aperture to the other, element of silence and mystery. So, I think that's why I am the writer that I am. I think that's why, I'm always just waiting for those stories to come, through me, in some way.
That's a very astute level of self-understanding.
Yeah. Well, generally I don't have a lot of self-understanding, but so, my wife keeps saying, you need to go and see a therapist at some stage. I'm like, no, I can't do it. I want to keep everything as blank and blocked off as possible. So I don't remember my dreams. People talk about dreams. And, when people say, oh, you should keep a dream journal, I think, I'd rather whatever's going on there just take place in its own little space, and that I don't intrude. So, so that's just sort of, I'm sure that's terrible, but there it is.
Well, we've talked a lot about, your character Jack and his compartmentalized existence and his slippery sense of identity, and this existence that he has as a kind of perpetual outsider in whatever context he finds himself in. He's never quite home. Mm-hmm. And I think that writers temperamentally tend to be outsiders, at least on some level. And I just mean that, we tend to be observers. We don't tend to necessarily find ourselves in the center of the action, or if we do, that's maybe not where we feel most comfortable. Mm-hmm. And then I think about your upbringing, where, your mother's raising you at first in Beirut, and then in London, and you find yourself, not really fitting in or feeling kind of outsiderish yourself everywhere you go. That's not necessarily the worst thing in the world for somebody who wants to write fiction. I guess my question is do you feel like there's an upside, to this feeling of sort of perpetual dislocation? Like it has in some ways served you well creatively, right?
I think it probably has. Yeah, it has served me well creatively. I mean, I came to writing relatively late. I actually went to university to do civil engineering, like my uncles. I think that this whole, as you say, I think writers are outsiders. They tend to be, often immigrants, or, I once met a writer who said that he was incompletely born into the world, which he actually seemed to see that seemed right for him, that somehow he had just never quite been fully born into the world. And so he always felt this incredible sort of distance from it, he was here and not here, which I certainly have felt. I think that there's a danger, for me, as I was saying, I was working on another big novel before this one. And it is, this huge book that I could lose myself in, right? I could exist within that creative space, within that imaginative space. I could have my relationships in it. I could live a kind of life within a creative world, because as a child, as someone who felt very much an outsider, I just wanted to retreat from life. And I think a lot of writers really, they're not very comfortable, in front of others, that I'm not a very spontaneous person. And so it was really comfortable for me to live in my fiction completely. But then you become detached from life, right? And so I have to make a real effort. I joined the Quakers. I joined a Quaker church. I'm trying to get out into the world a great deal more, so that there is this plus and minus with that sense of detachment, because it does make it much harder to deeply engage in a sort of present, real way with the very life that needs to feed your work. I mean, my work, early on was fed by my childhood, which, the childhood is the sort of dream of the adult life, right? It is the mythos, it's where our gods and monsters reside, which is why all my mothers, in my books have these sort of secrets, and all of my fathers are either ghosts or they're monsters, right? Because I grew up among these, all the fathers of my friends were often alcoholic. They were just not fathers that I envied in any way whatsoever. So, that's an intense time. And I think you have to maintain that as best you can, that connection to life, that open, sensual, intimate connection to life. You're talking about intimacy. For me, that's all that fiction is about. It is about, well, it's about two things: the twin pillars, intimacy and truth, right? So every scene is about intimacy, is about, and it's rooted in, when you think about the fall, right? I talked about the image of the two people in that Chevy Impala, right? As the Adam and Eve. And that is the key moment, right? The moment when, Adam, who was the earthling, who was one being, separates into two. That's the first division. And after they fall, then every other division comes, from, the religion and nation and tribe and all of these ethnicity, all of these separations that we are constantly trying to bridge and reconnect to find that sort of Eden that lies, that sacred place that lies beneath the surface of all the trouble of our lives, and in the book we have, Jack and his lover in Gaza, in that the strange, cracked, corrupted Eden of the broken house. You have all kinds of couples, little sort of Adam and Eves, who are these sort of star-crossed lovers in these various different places. So there's one who is the Maronite George with his Palestinian Muslim lover, Farida, who find themselves in a hotel in the hills above Beirut, and all the way through there is this touching to a kind of broken or corrupt Eden, which is, that it is beneath this world exists a sort of paradise, right? Which we touch upon sometimes when we connect to another person completely in one way or another. So we're always in that paradise. We're always in Eden, and we're always in hell, right? So, I think that whole, intimacy is, as you said, is what fiction is about.
Well, you mentioned that part of the silence that you are writing out of, the silences of your childhood, the twin silence of your mother and the traumas of her upbringing, and then the silence of absence when it comes to your father. Do you mind sharing how you lost your father? What happened to him when you were so young?
Yeah, he was in Libya, working for a company, and somebody had been arrested for drinking. You weren't allowed to drink in Libya at that time, and so it was quite late at night, and he got into a car to go and essentially bail them out. And he was driving in the desert, it was dark, and there's no lights on the roads, and he hit an animal of some kind. So he got into an accident. He was absolutely fine. He seemed fine, and he was taken to an American military hospital, but it wasn't very well equipped. So they didn't realize that his spleen had been ruptured, and so he was in this hospital for 3 days. There's a very sad story about this, which is my mother. We were in this house, in the hills above Beirut, this little villa. And so one day, my uncle Maroon comes up to the house and he says, my mother knew that my father had been in an accident, and they kept saying to him, oh, he's fine. He's absolutely fine. He's fine. And my uncle Maroon came up to the house, and he said, oh, you need to come down to Beirut to the house, to my grandparents' house. So she thinks this is great. She's very lonely. She doesn't see a lot of people. She gets on a beautiful red dress, her only real nice piece of clothing, and he drives her down to a house, and she walks into the house and she sees all these people. She can't really quite assimilate what's going on. She could see people crying, and she's looking around, and they didn't realize that she actually understood Arabic. She was sort of learning Arabic, and she could hear someone saying, oh, look at her, look at that woman, like sort of slightly insulting about the fact that she's wearing this dress. And then my grandmother says to my Uncle Maroon, has anyone told her what's happened? And he was too afraid to tell her. He couldn't bring himself to tell my mother that my father had died. So my grandmother had to grab her and pull her into another room and say, Sam is dead. He's gone. And at that point, she just didn't believe it. She couldn't believe it, and still couldn't believe it for years. So that's what happened to my father. That's and then my family wanted me and my brother to stay there, of course, but my mother couldn't stay. It was too haunted a place, I think, for her.
She needed to start over.
Yes, yeah, and it was really hard for her. I mean, she's I can't even tell you how remarkable a person she is. I mean, just incredible to come back to be in my grandmother's tiny council flat in London for a while, and then to, she got a job in a bank, sort of she taught herself shorthand, got a job in a bank, and then got a job in a pub, and sort of worked between jobs and just looked after us, and slowly got a degree at night to be a teacher, became a teacher. So, I just started life again in London, and didn't marry again until she was nearly 60. So,
oh, wow. But yeah. Like a great degree of resilience.
Incredible resilience. And, she's someone who had such a tragic life, and at no point would you know that if you knew her, never. She's just such a sort of incredibly lively, happy, engaged. And the other thing about her, and I think this is the thing, is that she loves, people. Like wherever we were, if she saw someone, if we were in line at the supermarket and she saw an old lady who looked particularly miserable, she would talk to her. She would grab her arm. Within minutes, they would be laughing together. And, as a kid, I hated this. I hated the fact that my mother talked to all these people, but she almost had this compulsive need to just engage with others. And if she saw anyone unhappy, she needed to stop that from being. And I didn't realize as a child that was a kind of miracle, right? That, when I think about my book, and I think about, people will talk about it. Well, it's about the Palestinian-Israeli situation, or he's Palestinian. It's really not. It's about that moment. It's about a moment when people, that sort of miracle, of connection, that really drives everything here. That's what I'm pushing every scene and every story toward. And sometimes it has a really hard time getting there, but that's the impulse, the drive of everything I write. And it really comes out of her goodness and out of her love of others, I think.
Yeah, that's well said. I mean, ultimately what human beings want, perhaps most of all, is to connect with one another and to, I don't know, escape ourselves a little bit, or just to feel, I don't know, a sense of like real relationship with like good, like positive, kind relationship with other human beings. And maybe especially so for people like Jack who feel so dislocated and don't feel rooted in a place, might be especially important. And that's part of the emotional impact of this book, are those moments when he does find that with the people that he interacts with.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is, and and of course there are moments where you want that moment so badly in the book, and I won't say which, but toward the end there's a moment, a very key moment with his wife Dimra, right toward the end of the book, where she does not call him by his name. And that for me is this moment of incredibly, for me, like one of the most powerful moments in fiction. Intimacy. All scenes are about intimacy. It seems to me, almost everything is about intimacy. But the most powerful moments are those moments of what I would call intimate estrangement, right, where you are incredibly intimate in that moment, but at the same moment, incredibly estranged. Right. So there are those moments. There are moments of real connectedness that the book moves to, and then in certain relationships, in certain the certain relationships that he has, there are these moments, they arrive at these moments of intimate estrangement, of this really powerful sort of node of incredible connectedness with Dimra and incredible disconnectedness with Dimra, right at the end of the book. So I think this is the sort of the landscape of a book as it moves between intimacy and estrangement. One of the writers whose writing I love is Mary Gateskill, and she has a sort of phenomenal capacity. Everything with her is about intimacy, is about what's going on between two people, and there are so many scenes that she has of this moment of incredibly intimate moment that is also incredibly estranging. I mean, like a simple example would be two people are making love and each one of them is thinking about someone else as they're making love, right? They're not thinking about each other. So this whole, this moment of connectedness and disconnectedness at the same time, which I think is so expressive of our human condition, of how locked away from each other we are and how much we want to connect to another person.
Well, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about your writing life. I mean, you've alluded to it here and there earlier in the conversation, but it's fascinating to me that this novel was born sort of by accident as you were stepping away from another novel that you were writing. I believe this is your fourth published book.
Yes.
Is that right?
That's right. Yes.
Has it gotten any easier? Is there anything different about this book in the way that it materialized compared to previous books?
I think, the only thing that I ever think about, with writing is just that I want to try to get better, in terms of craft. I mean, the only thing you really have control over as a writer is sort of the quality of the work, and the quality of the craft in the work, So for this book, I think that, it's a book that moves back and forth in time, which is technically sort of difficult to do. But I felt, I guess that's the only thing I would say, is that I felt more prepared, as a writer, to deal with the complexities of constantly moving back and forth in time. I mean, what I wanted to do was to have past and present infiltrate one another in a sort of complex emotional, psychological, and spiritual way. And, whenever you have a book where you have to keep moving back, there's so many technical issues that you have to deal with. So, for example, if I go into a scene in the past that is a sort of dramatic scene, that's much easier, right? Because people just can live within that dramatic scene in the same way that they will live within a present dramatic scene. But if you have when I have periods of time where I have a lot of exposition, as I do when we go back to find out about Jack's family, his father's family, and what happened after 48, and a huge amount of sort of his family history, then that's sort of exposition, and it's heavy, right? It has this sort of weight, this different tonality, this different density, and you have to find a way for the book to absorb and integrate and carry it. So, for me, I couldn't make craft decisions to have that information be at the center of the book rather than early on in the book. So it is really about having a little more technical savvy as as I sort of move on. This was a sort of, it's technically reasonably difficult to pull off. It's not that difficult a book because it really is just one point of view, but just that moving back and forth in a way that is integrative, as opposed to we just live in two different sort of timelines that where they come together as the book moves on. Was it easier? I think Thomas Mann says that writers are people for whom essentially writing is the most difficult thing. I think writing always feels difficult, and you can never get a sense of what your book is. Right? You work on your book for, and you know this. You work on your book for, this one took me 3.5, nearly 4 years, and then edits and things, and you could never get a pure experience of that the reader gets when they read that book. You can never get that sense, right? It's so, all of those revisions and rewrites. It's a strange relationship that you have with a book. And in the past, because of who I am, as soon as a book was done, I would drop it. I mean, I was not interested in it anymore. And I realized that there was something awful about that. And, it was like being a bad parent, that these were in some ways, these are the things that I've made, that are mine, and they're not children, but they are this creation, this collaboration with the world. But I think when I think about why I write, sometimes you do write out of a kind of wound, and what you want to do is create a thing that is perfect and completely separate from yourself, right? From this self that is so corrupted in one way or another, that you want to create a perfect thing and then move it away from yourself. And, as I say, I think that wasn't always a healthy way for me to be, just to then just think, I don't want to even think about that book anymore. I don't want to think about it. So I've tried to be better with this book. I've tried to, love it in a way. I've tried to feel like I want to love it, and I want to protect it, and I want to have it be successful in the world, as opposed to simply like I've separated this thing from myself, and now, I'm going to move on. And so I know that's a slightly weird thing to say, I guess, but it's just, it's a strange relationship to writing. I think writers have different relationships to writing, but that's, I think, mine.
So I believe that in the previous 3 publication cycles for your previous, 3 books, you lost your editor.
Yeah.
Like in the process, so that when the book was published, you had different people working on it. This is a very familiar story in publishing. Anybody who has published books or has been around publishing for a decent period of time will run into this. There's a lot of flux in the publishing business. Let's just put it that way. I have to ask you, is your editor still there with this one?
Thank goodness.
Did you break this streak?
Yes, I did. Yeah. She's at Norton. There's a woman called Elaine Mason. She's wonderful, absolutely amazing editor. And it just makes such a difference. I mean, you can't believe it. I lost my editors with both the British version and the American version of my book, of all my 3 books. I lost them, and sometimes within a few months I lost them. And then your book is completely orphaned. At one stage, I think with one of the British version of the Perfect Man, I had 3. They essentially just apportioned it between 3 editors, all of whom had their own books and had no interest in the Perfect Man. And I remember with the Perfect Man in England, the head of Random House kind of taking me out to a very fancy lunch. You always got to be worried if it's a very fancy lunch. So they took me out to a very fancy lunch just as the hardback of the Perfect Man was coming out. And she said to me, I'm sorry, Naeem, but we're just going to print 2,000 copies of the book. That's it. Essentially she was saying, we're just going to throw it away, And of course, then it was longlisted for the Booker. It won the Commonwealth Prize for the best book of Europe and South Asia. It got incredible reviews, and nobody could get hold of it. So it was that sort of writer's story of that nightmare where, it was a 3-month wait to get hold of it. And, friends of mine who thought they were being helpful kept sending me these sort of threads of readers, big readers groups saying, this is the least read and least available book on the Booker long list. Nobody could get hold of the book. So, but at the same time, I don't think anyone is really to blame. There's no one to blame for this, and there's no point in feeling bitter about it. As you say, this is such a common story. It just, and I feel for publishers because they're at this sort of pivot between art and commerce, which is a really, talk about the worst liminal place one of the worst liminal places you can be in is that pivot between art and commerce. And you've got to, you can love books, but you've also got to sell them, and you've got to make decisions about whether one book or another is going to sell. And they're really hard decisions to make. I don't think people really know what's going to, do really well and what's not a lot of the time. So, yeah. So it was a sad and nightmarish experience. To have it happen 3 times was really tough.
Well, I'm glad the streak is broken.
Yeah.
And before I let you go, I have to ask you, because, I think you talked about Jack living in this condominium complex, like he and Dimra live in this condominium complex, and they have, all these neighbors and interactions with their neighbors. You yourself live in a condominium building. Are you, or have you ever been, the HOA president?
Yes, I am right as we speak. I am the HOA president. Yes. I know exactly how hard it is. And, I've had people screaming in my face. I've had to mediate between people screaming at each other, all kinds of feuds that could almost become physical at times, and you just have to, figure out how to help people live together. And I have allies here in the buildings, people who are very, very good, and really help. But it is a thankless task. So, yeah.
I used to live, we used to live in a condominium building, and we had a neighbor who had a boyfriend who was into crystal meth. I mean, things can get out of hand when you're sharing space with a lot of different people.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's a strange community, because you're both really connected to people. It's a very porous space. You can hear things, you can hear people fighting, you can hear people making love. And also that like 2 people have died since I've been in the building. So, I've seen, one woman sort of waste away from cancer over a period of, 6 or 7 months. I've seen one person sort of wheeled out, covered up to an ambulance. So you have this incredible, talking about intimate estrangement, you're very connected, but of course you're not always friends exactly. You're just sort of sharing this space. But, it's a strange kind of community. So, yeah.
What I remember the most, or one of the things I remember the most, was riding the elevator.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you'd have a neighbor step on somebody you see in the hallway, but you don't really know. And then you're in that little crucible of the elevator. And I'm the kind of person who would talk in an elevator. If I see you, and I've seen you before, I'm going to say hello.
Right.
But there's a certain kind of person who's like, yeah, I'm not talking on the elevator. So I was always trying to navigate that.
Right. Yeah, that's really tough. Yeah.
Well, I always close by asking my guests if they're working on anything else. I mean, I have to believe that maybe some part of you, at least, is going back to the novel that you were originally working on when this current novel came to be.
Yes, that's what I'm working on right now, and we'll have to see. I mean, it's a hard choice. That's a huge novel. I hope it really depends upon how well this book does. Whether I could possibly sell a huge historical novel, like that. I know that's this weird. It's just this practical thing. It's. But I'm going to work on it because I do love it. I do think it's a very good book. I hope it's a very good book, and I put I've been working on it actually for about 20 years. So I put so many resources into it in so many ways. And I've always wanted to write. I love big books. I love books that you can immerse yourself in entirely with, large casts of characters. So that's the kind of book that I've always loved. And I would like to write one of those books. I just hope I can publish it. So.
Well, I wish you luck with it, and I thank you for the time. Congratulations, and I hope that this next book, whatever length it is, finds a home and does well. I tend to have faith in books that take a long time to cook. Like a 20-year process, it needs to find a home. It's clearly a story that you have to tell.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Okay, there we go. That was me talking with Naeem Murr about his new novel, Every Exit Brings You Home. Out there now from W.W. Norton and Company. Fascinating, right? Interesting guy, interesting life, interesting book. Again, it's called Every Exit Brings You Home. Go get your copy right away. Check out naeemmurr.com for more information. Don't forget to subscribe to The Other People Show wherever you listen, and follow me on Blue Sky and Instagram. Sign up for my newsletter over at bradlisti.substack.com. Support the show if you love the show over at patreon.com/otherpplpod. Sign up for my book club or get an Other People t-shirt, or do both at the show's official website, otherppl.com. Get yourself some in-depth audio courses about writing over at deepdive.audio. The latest course is called How to Write Literary Collage. And if you have a moment to spare, if you're feeling generous, please rate and review this show wherever you listen. It helps the show in the algorithm, and it helps it find new listeners. Okay, so that does it for today. I think we're done. Our work is done here. I hope you enjoyed it. I appreciate you being here, and I'll be back on Thursday, God willing, with my friend and co-host, Mira Gonzalez, an unpredictable millennial who always, a very high drama human being. She had a migraine a couple of weeks ago. There's always something, but hopefully we'll be back for the Thursday show, the pop culture series, Brad and Mira for the Culture. All right? Stay tuned.